I'm the CEO and founder of Senior Savvy and the host of this show, where you can find me every Tuesday interviewing people who are engaged and involved in impacting the lives of senior living operators and communities. Before we get started, let's go ahead and run the intro.
Uh-oh. Nothing like a good Tech Tuesday when it's frozen. It's okay.
Yeah. Jada, should we start over?
I mean, what if... There you go.
Yeah. Well, welcome back, everyone. You're hearing me. Okay. Whew. See, there's nothing like a Tech Tuesday without some tech issues, right? So, yes. Okay. We're going to go ahead and launch right into it and just hope and pray with fingers crossed that the show goes. So I want to welcome on my two guests today. I have Scott Smith. Scott, welcome to Tech Tuesday. I hope you can hear me.
Scott, hear you. There's a small lag, but you're good.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Scott is the National Director of Resident Programming at 5-Star Senior Living. Welcome to the show, Scott.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I also have a returning guest. We've got Sara Kyle, who is the strategic advisor for age tech and lifestyle design. She is the founder of LE3 and also one of the coordinators of the Evolve conference. Welcome, Sara.
Thanks, Abbie. So I guess you are still frozen, but I want to make sure that audio is working for other people, and we will just start going into it. Abbie, do you want to say anything else, or you want me to jump right in?
I'm going to try not to talk too much,
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think I'm adding anything to the broadcast today, so I'm going to try not to talk too much. Thank you.
Well, that was actually perfect the last 5 seconds. So if you want to jump back in, maybe you can. Well, thank you, Abbie. And we are so excited about this show. Each month, kind of what we're doing is shining some light on this idea of life enrichment engagement, and then how that leads up to our Evolve conference in the summer coming up. And as we do that, we want to interview, talk to people in the same space, and just get other examples and real life stories about what they've been able to do in organizations, large and small, what some of that has looked like. So today we have Scott Smith, my dear friend, on, and Scott to me has always been this inspiration because he just thinks a little bit differently. And when he talks, it's powerful. And what he's been able to do at a large organization, I think, is inspiring to a lot of people, but there's also a lot of teachable moments. And so, Scott, what I want to start with is I want you to tell, how long have you been at 5-Star? And then what was the immediate atmosphere, maybe when you came in, and then what has happened or transpired since then in terms of lifestyle, engagement, enrichment, whatever that programming is. And then also tell us kind of your role and position.
Yeah, so I appreciate you having me on. And the nice word you had to say, thinking differently. That's a very... It can be taken any way, but I'll take it as just someone who's kind of thinking outside the box sometimes. And so I've been with 5-Star now since April of 2021. Came in, just a lot of transition was happening, kind of going from a skilled nursing as one of our levels of care to kind of offboarding a lot of those communities. So a lot of turmoil, a lot of change was happening when I was first started. So current state, we have about 139 communities with assisted living, independent living, and with our memory care, what we would call our Bridge to Rediscovery program. And so coming in, I think there was a very kind of traditional vibe to to 5-star, which doesn't really fit the way I think about how we should be doing programming at times. It's a large organization. Things change and it moves a little slow sometimes. But really, one of the things I wanted to do is how do we bring some consistency? So how do we have a large portfolio of communities, and how do we create a consistent experience that really values kind of connecting for our residents? And so that was kind of the first thing, was let's get some consistency across the portfolio. Let's really get people to start to think about it just a little bit differently, from entertaining people to connecting with people.
You talk about that consistency, and a lot of times we define it as standardization. And I think people feel a little micromanaged when you think of standardization. If you don't know my community, but there is so much effectiveness and efficiency in standardization, because we know on a higher level what works, what's evidence-based, and what's been tried and true. And so when you were starting to implement some of that consistency, did you use standardization, or did you have any conversations or pushback with that?
So I think one of the things as humans, so I was going to say adults, not even older adults, it's adults, it's children, is we want choice, right? That's part of it. We want to have ownership. We want to have choice. So every decision that is made is still saying, how do I honor the choice of the person that is sitting in the seat in the community? And so I look at something as simple as monthly themes with programming guides, right? And so this idea of, I'm not telling you have to do these 6, 7, 8 programs. What I'm saying is, here's a list of 15 to 20 programs. Pick what you think will work in your community and modify it how you see fit. So we're honoring that independence and that critical thinking of that individual person, and we're honoring the individuality of the building and the residents. But we're still we are all doing programming around, like, this month it's gratitude. It may look differently everywhere, but it's the same theme and the same heart behind it. And so just like we should with our residents, with our team members, we want to make sure that we are still giving them that choice, because I think that's essential in a role that we're really going to be driving creative thinkers and people, right? So you can't put them in a box too much, but you also can't have kind of the Wild West. We need to kind of rein it in a little bit, because we do know what's best practices. And we do know that our job in programming is 80% current residents, 20% potential residents, right? There is still that sales component to it as well.
Sure. Yeah. One thing we've been talking about over the last couple of months, I know we've talked about with Steve, and Kelly and I have talked about it, is trying to figure out in this life enrichment world, we get passed around a lot. And I would like to say this because everybody wants a little bit of action of what's going on. But from a reporting structure at 5-star, what does your direct report look like? And what department do you fall under?
So I fall under what we would call our resident experience team. And so that would consist of myself, our dining. Right now I'm overseeing memory care as well. That's, kind of a new thing and maybe short-term thing. So it'd also be our Bridge to Rediscovery director. And we're looking at potentially kind of in flux, what is our, what we would call kind of clinical, but what we really be like our health and wellness, right? So my direct report right now, it's just changed a couple of times, is our COO. So, so right there. So I'm the national director reporting out to our chief operating officer.
Yeah. Sarah, I wanted to ask you a question. So do you typically find that someone who is in charge of creating activities and someone who's in charge of that programming is typically reporting to a COO or to someone else? And how is that dialed down at an individual community?
Yeah, great question. So what I find, I'll start at the corporate level and go down. It varies. And it's volatile, not in a bad way, just with executive changes, departments get replaced, right? Reassigned. Traditionally, you saw it under clinical when it first emerged. It's moved to ops. There are some organizations that believe it is absolutely a sales and marketing partnership. And so sales and marketing will oversee that. But you also have some organizations, I know Westminster's one, and Holiday went to this at the end, that they brought in experience under culinary and dining. And typically that was you'll have a national director that may have a culinary or dining background that's also overseeing that. I think that comes into play because yes, the partnership is there, but that dining budget and responsibility is quite extensive. And I think it's even closer to the resident than sometimes is the ops model. And that's just my initial thought and what I've seen happen. But it's everywhere. And I think that's something we also lack, because that reporting structure is important, because I think we set aside and make time for our direct reports. And when you are passed around and you don't really know your spot in the organization, and the organization doesn't know that department's spot, you lose traction. And sometimes it may take 2 or 3 months to get back these meetings that should be going on, that take place. You know, there's a weekly ops meeting. There's a weekly sales and marketing meeting without fail everywhere. There's a weekly dining meeting.
Yeah. I'm very curious, and maybe we'll talk about this. I'm totally curious about how you incorporate dining into your programming, and maybe we'll have a chance to talk about that, because I do see the two being interconnected. And then the other thing I want to talk about too is, you know, how do you decide what programs to add based on where your calendar and the other things that you have on there? I'm just curious, how do you gain that type of information?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of that decision is made at the community level, and I think, you know, that's where it needs to be made. So I think you want to have overarching themes, kind of ideas of what you want to have. You may have, you know, standards, right? So you might have quantitative standards of the number of programs you're going to have per day, you know, different dimensions of wellness you'll hear a lot of, so you have well-rounded programming. The actual decision of what kind of programs are going to happen are typically happening at the community level. Now, there are different things that we will talk about that we will be pushing, and we will say this is what we want to see, and try to chunk that into small steps. So, you know, for example, I'm really pushing, and we'll be looking at in January, is how do we get away from everything being about 40, 50, 60 people showing up, and how do we really make it meaningful? And so, not saying I want you to have, you know, this club, this club, this club, but saying I want you to identify 4 groups that you can create a club with. So whether that's retired teachers, whether that is, you know, a beer club, a wine club, a book club, like, and say, I don't care here's a group, here's 20 options, figure out what works in your building. And I want to see those happening once a week. Right. And so now that it comes back to them, it's still going to be that, you know, that buzzword, that person directed, because it's based on who is in that community. The idea is what corporate is coming up with. The community is implementing it, what works for them. And I think that's the big piece of this, is we can't micromanage, especially when you're looking at a large portfolio. It's never going to work. You have to hire the right people. You have to be very, very intentional with the hiring process of this role. And then you have to give them the resources and hold them accountable to use those resources.
Yeah. While we're here and we're talking about this, you know, I look at the title. Sometimes I'm kind of spontaneous and I just go places, but we look back at this title. So tying that question back to when you choose programming, when you're looking at those standards and processes, what was that why? How did you guys define that? How'd you get there? And how do you communicate that out, where if you went up to an executive director and said, what's the why behind engagement?
Yep.
That the answer is consistent.
Yeah. So for me, this starts anytime I'm interviewing somebody, when we have an orientation, when they're hired, like I have workshopped a phrase down to as few words as I possibly can to make it as simple as possible. And so to me and I always look at this, we call them lifestyle 360 directors, but you say life enrichment director, whatever. So what is the role of the life enrichment director? What is the why for them? And to me, it is to create genuine connections through meaningful experiences. Like that is what you will hear me say to them over and over again. So genuine connections through meaningful experiences. Your calendar is a tool that you use to create those connections. It is not the only tool. It is your biggest, bluntest tool, but it is just a tool. The goal of all of your programming should be to create a connection between individuals, because that expands the hours that you have engagement in your building. Yeah. If I have engagement for 8 hours a day, the resident lives there for 16 hours without anybody there to provide engagement. So they've become a entertainer. When I create connections, and I look at this and say, for you, Sarah, right? I see you and Sarah and Kelly. They're kind of this package deal sometimes, right? It's like everything you guys do together is more fun because you have a connection, right? I've been at conferences with you guys because you're together. Now, if you're not with her, you still may have fun, but it's just different when you have that connection with someone. So how do we get that into our community? We have to be intentional about it. Some of our residents haven't had to make a new friend in 40 years. They've watched their friend group shrink, and they don't know how to do that anymore. So our job is to create these genuine connections. You're not going to do it at a happy hour with 50 people. It's just not going to happen. You're going to do it in a small group book club, prayer group, wine club, something that's a group of 4 or 5 people, retired teachers, any of those things. That's how those connections form. And then at the end of the day, you have programming for 16, 18, 20 hours a day because I'm with my friend.
Yeah.
So, to me, when the simple answer I went on for a long time is genuine connections through meaningful experiences. That's the why.
Yeah. Well, and that's what's so important is that people can recite that. It's not a long mission statement. You don't have to give someone a $25 gift card to, memorize it for a meeting.
Yep.
People can jump onto that, and then you build around that. And then you start to say, okay, how do we know if this is successful? Yes, we can see faces. We can have anecdotal stories. We can see buzz happening and connections happening. But then how do you start to quantify these connections? And there are certain questions that we can start asking if we think of, random surveys or annual surveys where we strategically create questions that talk about connection.
Let's hear that. Yeah, let's hear that because I'm thinking, let's hear it. Let's put it into practice. I would love to hear that.
Yeah.
So to me, this is one of the things that I have not done this yet, but this is in my kind of future goals 2023. It's a 1-question survey. Do you have a close friend living in the community? That's
Exactly.
it. That's it. And the answer is yes or no. And if the answer is no, I have to figure out how to make that answer a yes. And so my goal should be that I'm at 100% yes on that. We have introverts. We have people who don't want to leave their room. That's okay. If I have a close friend who's stopping by, I'm living a full life. So to me, if you're looking at low-hanging fruit, like ask that question in your community. Do you have a friend living in the community? If the answer is yes, then we are on the right path for sure.
But what I love that you said, Scott, was a close friend.
Yeah.
Right. Defining that difference between an acquaintance, a neighbor, or a trusted close friend. And then I think that's where we start to segue of, if I know, you can do the 3-question quality of life. I mean, only UCLA scale of loneliness. That just has a bad. It's a good tool, right? It's a standardized, evidence-based tool, but people don't want to be talking about why you keep asking me if I'm lonely, right? You told me to move in this community because I won't be lonely.
Yeah.
But you can ask that periodically too and see how that changes. So it's not just a one-time-a-year thing. But if we know people are connected, the other thing Kelly and I talk about too a lot from that one question, when you wake up for the day, do you have a purpose?
Yep.
Is there something you're excited about doing? Right. If we know that friends or people live with their friends and they're excited about something, do we care if they went to bingo 8 times or sat in the room with a bunch of people? No.
Right. And one of the things I really just kind of fell in love with and really kind of formed a lot of what I was thinking about. I'm looking at programming really came down to the blue zones, right? So you start looking at the blue zones. Where are people living to be over 100 years old? And one of those things, right, we look at is Okinawa, Japan, and they have a word for that, right? Ikigai, like it's reason for being. Like
say that again. Can you say that again?
I will never be able to spell it, but ikigai, reason for being. Like that's what it translates to. And if you have that, right, that creates a reason to get out of bed. That creates purpose, and that is essential. And connections and friends can be your reason for being, right? And so to get up and to see that person, to take care of this person, to help with this. So when you're looking at programming, right, we look at 5 dimensions and we talk about spiritual programming. And one of the things I'm really looking at is as spirituality is shifting in our country and what does that mean is anything where you're doing something beyond yourself, that's a spiritual program, right? If volunteering is spiritual, giving back is spiritual. So how do we break away from these traditional ideas of it's church, it's Bible study, it's hymns, and go, no, it's also a crocheting club who is making they're making hats for people who have cancer, right? Or we're teachers. I always go to teachers. I used to be a teacher. We're going into the schools, and we have residents who are reading to kids or letting kids read to them. One of the things that I really just want to continue to dig into as an industry is we have the largest group of people in our community. Let me rephrase this. The number one group of people who do the most volunteer hours in this country are older adults. We have an entire building full of older adults, and we are paying people to try to entertain them.
Yeah.
Like, why are we not creating a connection? So when I talk about connections, one of the connections I look at is a connection between our building community and our city community. That's a connection. And so we have a large group of people who are a huge part of the volunteer base. So how do we connect them back to that? And that gives them purpose. That creates spiritual programming outside of your norm. And so those are some of the things that they're tough to do at scale, right? But but building by building is something that you can really look at.
I think it's so valuable because if you could get outside of yourself and serve someone else, it's creating such a deep level of purpose and fulfillment that, I'd like to say a lot of other things are not going to do, including bingo. But what if you had to think about some things that just have to go? What stuff has to go? What are some myths that we need to let go of so that we could push forward?
So there's a short-term and a long-term answer to this. So when you start looking at like what I would say, like when Sara talks about like things differently, like long-term to me, the calendar has to go. Like the idea of a calendar being what drives our engagement in our community is so antiquated. None of us live life that way outside of big events, right? So the big things. And so identifying, 4 or 5 programs a month that you're like, I want everyone to know about this. But other than that, it should be this idea that we do one thing at 2:00, one thing at 3:00, one thing at noon. It should be there are options at every single hour. It goes back to what we talked about with our team members who they want choice. So do our residents. Yeah. So the concept of one thing is happening at 11, take it or leave it, like we can't continue that long term. And the way to get around that is you create more people leading programming. And it's resident-led programming. It's care team-led programming. It's who has a passion for this and let them lead that a little bit, because if I have a passion for it, I enjoy it. So I have a care team member who is very spiritual and loves Bible studies. Let them lead a Bible study, right? Like they're now caring for a group of 10 people. They're doing their job. Yeah. And so that to me is the long-term thing. I think a lot of people are like, oh, yeah, get rid of bingo. Like, I'm fine with that, right? I'm okay with that. That's fine. I don't want it every single day, but for me, it is this idea that there's one option at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, and we live by that. There's no room for moving that around.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing is, we don't want residents will sometimes say, I don't have to choose. Well, no, actually, you having to choose helps you know what's most important to you. This is a good thing. Scott, one thing I want to talk about, and I do want to come back to John Zeisel's comment too about engagement. But what has to go? There's 2 things that I think are so important. I think we have to start purchasing supplies and resources from dignified, mature places. If there is anything in your building that could be used in I would say 5th grade and under classroom, please just throw it away. Throw it away, right? There's nothing that hurts me more is when you go into memory care and you see little Tykes tools or toys. And we're so far beyond that because there's so many options and choices now that you can do. And the other thing is this idea that we are so scared of older adults doing physical exercise in a standing position. Right? If you have to have 2 groups, have 2 groups, but take the chairs away. I will tell you the chairs you are using to do exercise are more dangerous than some of these people standing. Yeah. If you look at where they're grabbing onto them, I've seen chairs with wheels on linoleum floors. They're not stable. So don't get so scared of letting people do it. Yeah. And John, you had a great question, and it almost makes me want to go back to, we should have started there. or your comment about this idea that engagement, what do we even know what engagement is? And talked about this a few times, and I think, Scott, you would agree that engagement is different to every person. But and what I like is you've totally done away with that word, Scott, when you think about lifestyle 360 directors and you talk about meaningful connections, right? So we do start to define engagement with more, I would say, explainable. I don't even think that's something, but more descriptive words that can't be so ambiguous for people's interpretation.
Sure.
And, before you even start your why, if you're in this organization, of how do you determine what is going to be our term? And if we're calling it engagement, what is engagement to us?
Well, and I look at that, and I think that's another thing that we have to kind of define and understand. So the idea of like a calendar and programs, things like that the reason I feel like they're there is because it makes it easy to manage people, right? Like I know where somebody is at 11 o'clock. I know that they're doing their job. When we look at engagement, that happens in group and out of group. And so when I say that we want to create, this, connections, and that is engagement, I look at the two gentlemen sitting on the front porch drinking coffee together every morning. That's a program. That's engagement. Those two are good. I don't need to worry about them coming to my 1 o'clock, program, because they have each other. They have a genuine connection. And they are engaged with each other. So when I look at engagement, it is the idea of people coming together and interacting with each other, right? And so through a shared experience. And so that can happen scheduled. And I think that's a great way of doing it because that creates a little bit of consistency and a culture in your community. But it can also happen outside of that. And that's why the connections matter, because when you have connections, engagement is happening without it being staff-led or team member-led. To me, it's essential that we redefine what engagement looks like. And I know we get this idea, we're taking attendance, this person hasn't been engaged, but it's, man, if they have a genuine connection to talking to people, that's why dining's so important, right? Because that's a program. When I sit down to a meal and I sit down with the same people, we have a conversation. That's a great program. It's a small group program.
Yeah.
And Dr. Jody, I do totally agree that thank you for calling me out on this one, because I don't want it to be misconstrued. But yes, if you have the supportive and assistive devices, add those to it. It does bring a level of comfort and confidence that you're not going to have for someone who wouldn't be willing to do that. But don't.
Sara, I want to bring this back to the Evolve conference, which is going to take place in mid-2023. And how much of what we're talking about today in terms of envisioning the role, envisioning the engagement, envisioning the calendar, how much of that is going to be discussed at the conference?
We are going to try to do so much with that. But, the one thing I'm excited about is we can have these discussions, and they're discussions. When we're coming into Evolve, we want every session to have some type of takeaway in a worksheet form that you can go back and sit down and put this conversation to paper, to a strategic plan, to an annual plan, to a thematic plan, whatever that may be. And so every session where we talk about this, it will have a blueprint and an outline for you to kind of sit down and say, with my team, where do we go with this? Where do we start? Where are we at? And then what is the end goal, final state? But that was the big thing we decided this year, is every session needs some type of supplemental resource. So we're not just talking. We talk a lot. Right? But how do you get that action?
Yeah. I love it. That makes so much sense. Well, as we wrap up here, I got to tell you, just talking to you too, and seeing the responses of people who are writing in, to me, there's no doubt that there's so much more that needs to be discussed here and developed and, just collaborated on. So I'm really excited to see where this leads us. And I know that other people who have been chiming in today are as well. So thankful that you're shedding light on this and you're bringing it to the forefront. So well done. And if someone wants to get in touch with you, Scott, and you, Sara, what's the best way? Sara, you go first, please.
Kyle at le3solutions.com.
Perfect. And Scott.
Yeah, so smith14 at 5ssl.com. That rolls right off.
Right off the top.
You can find me on LinkedIn as well. And just real quick, low hanging fruit. If you want to take, what do I tangibly take away from this? Ask your residents the one question, like, do you have a close friend? And then find out the no's and who are they as individuals? What are they passionate about? And how do we match them up? How do we become a matchmaking service for friendships in our communities? When you know those numbers and you know who is a no, figuring out how to get them to a yes. Like that's something we can do after today.
I was talking with another Engage Life director, and he was saying that he's putting together these speed engagements. Yep. It's sort of like speed dating, but speed engaging. And so, you sit down, you talk, you answer a couple questions, and move on to the next person so that you can find other people who have similar interests.
Yeah, we've done those in the past. They're great, and it's a way to get to know somebody you didn't think you just don't think you have a lot in common. You find out you do.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And it's been a great conversation. I can see why you're both so engaged and successful at what you're doing. And we're very grateful for you to bring those concepts and bring those ideas to our viewers. So thank you so much. And for those of you who joined us, hats off. You guys have been awesome today with your participation. And we thank you so much. And we'll see you back here next week. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.